How are you doing?
Good. We're live now. Hello, viewers. Welcome to Canada Bangladesh Social Justice Action Research Alliance. Apologies for our slight delay. Today we have a very special guest with us. One of my favorite people in Canada, Doly Begum. Doly does not need any introduction. I'll just give her a brief introduction just to begin the program. In June 2018, at the age of 29, Doly Begum became the first member of the Bangladesh expatriate community in Canada to be elected as a member of the Ontario Provincial Parliament. The New Democratic Party MPP has become an ardent voice of the Bangladesh immigrant community in Ontario, says the Daily Star, one of the most prominent English newspapers in Bangladesh. Doly Begum hails from Bazaar district of Bangladesh. Her father migrated to Canada along with her mother and a younger brother when she was very young. Doly completed her undergraduate studies from University of Toronto and MSc in Development Administration and Planning from University College London. I didn't need that anyway, but you don't need any introduction. But let's begin the conversation. You have a very tight schedule. Doly, thank you very much for making some time for us.
Thank you for having me. It's wonderful.
The first question to you, tell us about your journey from Bangladesh and all the way from Bangladesh to Ontario's provincial parliament, and how did you get involved in Canada's social justice issue?
Well, to all your viewers, Assalamu alaikum, adab. I'm very pleased to be joining this wonderful event that you host. I think you recently started, and yeah, so I'm I would say it was a strange journey that isn't very unique, because it's very similar to many other Bangladeshi Canadians that live in Canada. Very similar to that. My parents moved here when I was very young, and it was because they were searching for a better life. And coming here meant that their kids will get a better education. Their daughter will hopefully go into university and get a good job, a better life. And that's pretty much what I think a lot of Bangladeshi Canadians, or any Bangladeshis that moves abroad, away from their friends and family members, their immediate family members, that's the goal. That's the reason they sacrifice everything. So for me, my parents did the same thing, and it's been quite the journey for myself and my brother, because I have a younger brother, and both of us, I think, have been very lucky. In many ways, we're privileged because we were able to have an education that we may not be privy to if we're in Bangladesh or if we're somewhere else, and we were able to continue on to dream of things that I know for myself I may not have been able to dream of growing up elsewhere. So it's been, I think. In many ways, I would say we're privileged. Obviously, you said, I went to university. I did end up going to university. I didn't think I would, and I studied development. That's what I thought I was going to end up doing. I wanted to make sure that I could contribute in many ways to our communities, whether it was local or international. I wanted to go back to Bangladesh and do some work there, especially things that I felt passionate about. But eventually it ended up being, I'm not really sure how the politics route turned into, for me, but it ended up, I think, in informing my decision to get into politics. So my education in development, my political science degree, sort of informed that decision to get into politics, especially provincial politics. So that's sort of a summary of a lot.
Yeah. Now you have touched on something that informed politics or informed engagement. I think from Bangladesh or from around the world, a lot of us, when you look at Canada, we have a perception that it's a land of milk and honey, without actually trying to understand Canada critically. And yes, as Bangladeshi immigrants in Canada, we enjoy a lot of benefits. We have a lot of privileges that people in many parts of the world, they don't enjoy. Having said that, and as you are trained in political science and development, let's complicate the discussion. One of my favorite things to do, which is Canada enjoys a very good reputation globally about a country of multiculturalism. But if you move up close and start examining, you find out not so simple, right? So how do you expose or how do you critically view Canada's multiculturalism myth? I'm not saying that we should throw the baby with the bathwater. Say, how do you actually look at it critically so that we have an informed perspective about Canada?
Well, you've touched on a very big issue that I think we're trying to tackle with right now, as political members of the society, but also as a society in a whole, in Ontario and in Canada. We are still trying to tackle this because this is something that is twofold. One, we have to first admit there is a problem, and there seems to be a little bit of that going on in terms of not admitting that we still have a long way to go, and the second part is obviously coming up with a solution, and we're still juggling with admitting that there is a problem because obviously in the world stage, Canada has a very good reputation, and yes, Canada's done an incredible job in terms of in the past, providing aid or the way that we've built a relationship with other countries. But that doesn't necessarily mean, we get to sort of cover up some of the injustices that's taken place in this country, in this province, in our communities. And that persists. So it's not that, it was in the past, it's still continuing. When you said Milk and Honey, I thought of Rupi Kaur, one of my favorite authors. And she's one of those people who really points out some of the things that we I think we sort of try to put a blanket on, and it's really important that when we look at the issue we're facing with racial discrimination, anti-Black racism, discrimination against the people of this land, the Indigenous communities, we still have a huge problem. The fact that we have communities within Ontario. I'm not even talking about northern Canada. I'm talking about in this province. We have communities, just kilometers away from Thunder Bay, for example, that's been under the boiled water advisory for the last 25, 26 years. That is a huge problem. And we're not talking about, some country that's still going through development. We're not talking about, and I quote this, third world. I have a huge problem with that concept myself. So we're not talking about a country that's going through this process or seen as a country that's suffering in terms of economically. I think if you're looking at it from the world stage, it's doing pretty well. Then why do we have communities that still needs cold water? Because they don't have access to clean, fresh water. We still have communities where children are committing suicide because they don't see a future. And that is a huge problem. And first, we have to admit that that's a problem. And second, we have to make sure that we have a solution that takes into consideration the communities that are actually affected. So it cannot be a top-down approach. It cannot be what I think is right. It has to be what these communities need, and how we can actually make sure that they're given the right opportunity, they're given the life that they truly deserve. And listen, I haven't even gone into the problem of injustices and how we're going to actually overcome that, because I don't think we can ever erase that, and we have to make sure that we actually address the fact that there is an injustice.
Yeah. Doly, your sound is let me just try to see. Can you hear me right? Can you hear me clearly, Doly?
I can hear
All right.
you. There's a little
good.
Delay, but I think
Okay, thank you. You have touched on something very important, that before we can't tame a problem if we can't name a problem. So let's talk about well, obviously we are talking about a country that has a history of blatantly denying the history of oppression. Let's talk about Indigenous issues. Let's talk. I mean, just 2-3 days ago, I saw the CBC report in Toronto. 83% people in COVID-19 cases are people of who are Black and people of color. Let's talk about discrimination. Now, I didn't want to ask this question this early, but it's perfectly segues to this question. Is we come from a country that had almost 300 years of British colonial history, and as a student of social science, I happen to believe that it creates, it has a psychological impact on us. We have an attitude of slavish gratitude. We don't want to rock the boat too much, keep our eyes on the aisle, and don't challenge, right? So you are not only a public representative, you have grown up in that Bangladeshi community. You have a very intimate understanding of that community. Why do you think, in many cases, we Bangladeshis in Canada are in a denial to speak very blatantly, unapologetically? Where does that shame come from? Why do we not talk about it very unabashedly?
Well, first, can I say it's been a long time since I heard the azan out loud. So that was
Yeah.
my motherland. It makes me all the viewers. I can't wait to understand. What you said. I think there are different layers of we have decades and centuries discrimination, of injustices, of a system that that was built to undermine groups of people, doing so I think that's a much bigger discussion in terms of what we can do, and how we can stand up for it. I think it'd be unfair to say that that people of color, for example, are not standing up, because they are right now. And I was just at a protest just this weekend. Was it this weekend? It's we have quite a few things happening. So it feels like it's a long strand of hours, especially during COVID time. But when we're talking about injustices, when we're talking about standing up for the Black community, or for the Indigenous community, or otherwise racialized communities, we have people come from different backgrounds, and just to stand up for each other. And sometimes it's not to say that people from the white community, the Caucasian community, don't come forward either. They do, and so what I'm trying to say is it's very important to make sure that we recognize our allies, we recognize the friends in this fight, and we recognize the people who have also been who have gone through this injustice, because it's not just like the colonial past in terms of South Asia, in terms of our ancestors. They have a huge history, but it's a little different than what people hear in terms of slavery, and it's different from what the residential schools, for example, looked like. So, but the pain. I think you cannot really compare the pain, because it was still pain, and it's still erasing a whole generation. It's still erasing or an attempt to erase a person's identity. So there's a lot of layers to that I think we need to unpack in terms of understanding what happens when we're trying to stand up against anti-discrimination, against anti-Black racism, against any of these problems, and then unpacking why are we and how are we doing this as well. For me, and I can speak for myself, because as a brown woman in politics, I have a different role when I try to address something to do with the Indigenous community or anti-Black racism, versus when I deal with something to do with the Muslim community, for example, because I belong to that community, or when I'm talking about a racialized brown woman, because I feel that I can say this is a community where I know exactly what's going on, whereas this is a community I have to make sure that I open up that stage and provide the voices or help the voices of the community members who have been affected, and I stand as an ally, and that's the difference. And we have a lot of politicians here, and I can speak as a politician. We have a lot of politicians here who do something called performative activism, if I may say that. I'm not sure if that's a real concept, but I feel that we have a lot of performative activism that happens, from our prime minister to our premier. We have seen them kneel, at protest. We have seen them come forward and say that they're against racism, or they're an ally, but you can't really call yourself an ally. It's the people who are affected. They're the one who get to call you the ally. They're the one who get to decide whether you're actually acting like a friend, where you're actually standing up or not. So that performative activism doesn't really help, and that's a huge problem. So whatever may be, the color of your skin, it depends on how we stand up for these issues, and also making sure that we don't take that center stage. So when I'm talking about helping, a fellow community, for example, member, or another community that's going through injustice, for me, it's making sure that the stage is there for those people to come forward and share their stories. For me, it's about making sure that I raise those voices in Parliament and create a path so that people from the Indigenous community, people from the other communities, for example, can actually be in those seats as well. So it's not just me representing them, because I may not be able to represent them as well as they would within their communities. And that's very important, because it's I think sometimes we forget that. I think sometimes we forget that taking a selfie at a protest it's not going to fix the problems. And if we have our prime minister doing that, we need to really check ourselves a little bit and see if we're actually fixing the problem or not.
Yeah, absolutely. I do agree with you that as the brown immigrants in Canada, and I say this very unapologetically, that doesn't matter, and however long I live in Canada, I'll always be a hyphenated Canadian. Means Bangladeshi Canadian, or hyphenated Canadian. Particularly when we are the direct beneficiary of 500 years of resistance that Black and Indigenous people have been putting up with. So you and I are the direct beneficiary of it. But somehow we buy into that model minority myth. I agree with you that yes, obviously, people of color, I'm talking about South Asian community, they are participating, in resistance. And this is absolutely my opinion. I can speak for myself, that I just particularly feel that, we don't actually stand in solidarity to the extent we benefit from it. So that's absolutely my personal take, given that, Bengali Muslims have been in North America as early as 1880s. Our existence in North America wouldn't have been possible without the solidarity extended by Black and Indigenous community and the Puerto Rican communities in North America. Now, the conversation that I want to particularly you have, and you are one of the best persons to ask this question, because you have navigated academia as a brown woman, as a brown Muslim woman in Canada. Also, you have studied in UK. And you are a community representative, so obviously you have insight. So when we from Bangladesh, and I'm an educator, I have been a guidance counselor, I've admitted hundreds of students abroad. So my perspective about studying abroad before actually starting to live in Canada permanently was one kind, but when I live there now, so that's day in, day out reality is very different. Now, how would you explain structural racism in education, be it elementary or secondary or tertiary education in Canada?
Well, I think, you touched on quite a few things. And if, we can talk about the education system for hours, whether we're talking about different levels. And as a critic for early learning and childcare, I feel that recently I have, opened my mind to a whole different level of understanding for children's education and development. But yeah, I think there are a few things in terms of myself going through the education system, because when I came to Canada, I didn't speak English, so it was really interesting for me to come from Bangladesh, and I honestly feel like sometimes we have much more advanced level of education in grade school in Bangladesh, and then obviously coming here, I thought, oh, this math class. But it means that we have gone through, well, what I have gone through is very different from what my kids, for example, would go through, or my grandkids will go through, and especially for those of us who are, 1.5 generation, or if I may call it that, it's a very different experience. So it's hard for me to speak to what the younger children are going through, especially Bangladeshi Canadian children who were born here. And I say Bangladeshi Canadian children who are born here because I want to go back to the point that I feel that it's important to keep your roots, and that's what Canada claims to be. Is that we're not a melting pot, we're a mosaic, and if we're going to claim that, let's live up to that, and we have to make sure that we keep our identities. So no matter who you are, where you come from, or what you where you end up being, stay continue to keep that root with you, and then associated with where you are at that moment. And for me, that's important because I call myself a Bangladeshi Canadian, and I will continue to do so. But within our education system, I think, and if I understood your question correctly, I think, right now we're navigating the system that wasn't necessarily built for kids with racialized background, for example. So even within the Ontario education system, we are continuing to face a lot of issues where racialized kids, where Black kids, for example, have a lot of concerns when it comes to the way they're treated. Whether we're talking about the rate of suspensions, where we're talking about the disciplinary actions, or the way and let's just step into the classroom for example. I have had from classrooms to university teachers where sometimes in a conversation you have to hold back and say, but that's not really how I viewed history, and that's I want to be mindful of time, so I'm trying to summarize what I'm talking about. But I studied political science in my undergrad. And when we looked at politics, when we studied some of the authors, there are times we only study the Western authors, for example, or scholars or philosophers. But what it does is for a kid who's growing up here and only going through that system, and unless you yourself, embark in your own journey to learn more and really open your minds to it, just through the education system, sometimes you're limited, and that vision becomes a very tunneled kind of way you're learning about Western philosophy per se, and that's very problematic because it doesn't show you what many other world philosophers, many other whether we're talking about the Middle East, whether we're talking about Africa, whether we're talking about like the entire regions that we're missing out of amazing work, amazing history that's completely eliminated from the system here. And especially for children who are from those areas, who have some idea of, from their family members or from the education system that they come from, you feel like you're on a bridge and you're not really gaining the full experience, and that is very problematic. And obviously, I'm not an educator, nor did I, have an education degree, so I can't even talk about pedagogy. I can't talk about curriculum making. So there's a lot of issues with that, and how we teach kids from different racialized backgrounds as well. So I'll leave it there because I think there's a lot more to touch on this topic.
Yeah. I have seen you that you are very passionate about promoting Bangla language, in Bangladeshi community in Toronto, obviously rightfully so, understandably. Now, when it comes to colonization through education, obviously by teaching Eurocentric Western pedagogy, knowledge actually puts establish their superiority psychologically, right? So obviously, when who we are gets denied at the expense of establishing Western superiority intellectually, that's very convenient. It's intellectual ways of colonizing who we are. Now, one might argue, and some people have argued, that the public schools in Canada has been resegregated. Like schools are located based on postal code. Like why do you have a French immersion school? Why do you have a certain kind of a school in certain localities? Now, what is your view on that?
And do you mean the I guess the types of school system that we have in Ontario and
the types of school and the resources that are available on this school, the kind of teachers that you have in different areas, where do you find what kind of teachers and what kind of subjects are taught, resources, and also location wise?
Mm-hmm. Well, so I think so we have a few different systems here. We also have a growing a system of privatized schooling as well, which is another day's topic. I think that I hope you get to talk about sometimes, because yeah. So what I can say is, in terms of our public education system, and what we have, we are, and you said something, a very interesting phrase, which was really teaching sort of the Western superiority. And I think there's a lot of work that's being done right now, especially by leaders who are racialized, who have been trying to break the barriers, who have been trying to dismantle this whole system. One of my colleague, Laura May Lindo, who is the chair of our Black Caucus, has been raising the issue in our school district boards in terms of how do we deal with the underlying sort of racism that takes place, where it's sort of a neo-colonial way of going through the education system, where many children of people who were discriminated, like kids whose ancestors went through the colonial system. Now these kids are having to listen or learn in an education in a system where they're told that they're let's say, for example, wars, that let's take in or contributions to communities, society. Sometimes these kids will be taught that their ancestors' contributions were not enough or not as significant as as the others, or the Western leaders, for example. And that's a very and there's a lot of problems with and I feel like I'm going really deep into what happens with our schools, and what, for example, what I face, what I've seen many of the kids in our communities face, many of the kids that I talk to even today. And I'm talking about, I went through the school system more than a decade ago, and I hear it even today, where kids are feeling like they still get to hear, during the war, who really led the fight, for example, or how many were killed that were from say, white versus black versus brown. And I want to be very clear, we're not undermining anyone's contribution. When you say one group matters, or when you say one group has contributed something, we have to be very mindful not to say that the other group didn't. And just by highlighting this one group doesn't mean that you're really undermining anyone. And sometimes I think folks who are very afraid of addressing certain issues, sometimes they will use those arguments to undermine a whole movement. And that I think, and that comes back to talking about Black Lives Matter. That talks about movements where we're trying to address a lot of issues, whether it's in the education system. Because I don't feel that we have created a system where a Black kid in a classroom can actually say what he or she wants to say openly, and feel like that's welcomed. Recently, within this province, we talked about having racialized people in the decision-making process. And I think we have pushed, as opposition members, we have really pushed the government to make those decisions. We also have incredible, trustees or leaders in our communities who are fighting that fight to make sure that the education system that we have if from superintendent to trustees to politicians who are making the decision, if they don't have any lived experience, if they don't understand the system, if they don't look like the people who are being educated, the students in the classrooms, then they may not actually understand how to have how to create a system that really works. And that is very problematic, because right now we're still trying to dismantle the old system where a lot of kids, like even myself, didn't feel like they belonged. And I think that continues. And I didn't even talk about universities where I have heard ridiculous phrases where a professor once said that colonialism was a necessary part of history to make parts of the world civilized. I mean, how disgusting and ridiculous is that? And the fact that someone gets to get away with that and have young kids, first year students who are scared to speak out, have that, and then when you actually question this, you're seen as sort of the problem child within that classroom, and that's the problem we're still facing, and it's 2020, which sometimes I'm shocked to see that I feel that things that we notice and obviously people before us have experienced, and like I said before, I don't think my experience is even close to what people of the indigenous communities experience, that kids from our residential kids experience, or the Black community experience, or people people who came in the early the 90s, for example, or the 80s, when we had racialized people first come to these countries throughout the past many decades. I think their experience was very different than what it would look like tomorrow. And we have to be very cognizant of that. We have to be very mindful of how we understand that. And we also cannot undermine the experience that kids tomorrow will come and experience, even though they may have it. I know it's simpler to say, oh, you have it so much easier. But I think that's also another problem that we have to be very mindful of, because sometimes we're a little bit unfair to our children or the next generation by saying that, oh, we have gone through the struggle. You don't have half of it. It just means that we're not really giving them the space to share what they're going through.
Yeah. I think you have touched on something very important. As you have mentioned, the kind of experiences people have at the university. I went to a conference called RISE. I went to Canada as an international student. Before going through the immigration process. So as long as you're an international student, I'm sure you have had classmates who are international, and what are their experiences, what you can and what you cannot do. I have watched. So there's I don't want to name people. So there's one Facebook group, Bangladeshi community Facebook group discussion that I was watching, that I was observing. One parent wrote in a group asking for suggestion that, hey, my daughter came back from school and I saw a bruise mark on her head, swelling. I don't know, what should I do? And then obviously, so I was observing the conversation comments, using my sociological imagination as a student of social science, that, okay, what does it actually mean? Why people say what people say. And I think what happens in Canada is the production of silence. I don't think a lot of the parents, I'm speaking particularly about Bangladeshi experiences. Let's say, I go from Bangladesh to Canada. I don't know, what is the school system is like that. I don't know what my, daughter or son is actually going through. So when I don't know the system and the, school system, people in the administration who know that, I don't have all the know-hows, it's easier to deal with me, as opposed to somebody, if the white parents of the white kids who have their ways to hold them accountable for a lot of things. So that is something that we probably in another conversation sometime in future, that what can we do to educate the immigrant parents that how do you navigate through a system. And I've been educated for almost 20 years, so that's something. And the politics of pedagogy is something that I'm passionate about.
Actually, So I want to touch on one thing though, because I think it's before we even get into that, I think it's very important to talk about giving the parents, and we're talking about, let's say we're talking about Bangladeshi parents, and as a Bangladeshi Canadian, when I came here, both of my parents, they walked into schools, they listened to the teachers, and then they walked back. I mean, they didn't even imagine questioning or asking, why did this happen, or this is great, how, and forget about any of those things. So looking back, I think it's very important to understand a few things, which includes, are we enabling? And when I say enabling, I'm very careful of the word, because there, first we're talking about immigrant families or people who are coming here to make a livelihood without anything. So from rent to groceries to bills, they have all these expenses. So my father was working from the start of daylight to for 14, 18 hours, and then coming home, sleeping, and then walking out the next morning. And sometimes we would get up just to say hi, because he was basically getting up during Fajr time, for example, and as early as possible he was heading out the door, which meant that he wasn't the person who's literally able to go to had the time to go to the school to stand up for their kids or understand what was going on, to understand the needs of the children. So even before we try to say, well, let's try to educate the parents, or let's try to figure out or have parents council and make sure that racialized people or children are represented better by their parents. Well, yeah, that's great, but are we really making sure that we have a society or we have a community where these parents have the time to do that, because they're just trying to put food on the table? And right now we're not even doing that. And I think even as politicians, we have a responsibility to make sure that we have a society where we have basic income, for example. We have people who are making a living. We have people who are able to pay the rent. And now I can go into housing problems. We can talk about income. We can talk about the type of jobs available for these parents. So a lot of these issues really play a big role in terms of how much time and efforts that parents can give to these children. And I was one of those kids who didn't expect the parents to come and really rep or help or stand up for the needs of their children. And I didn't expect it. And I didn't expect it because I knew that my father was trying to put food on the table and pay the rent, and my mom didn't speak English, and she was, and it was a very early around for us, where my mom sort of became the head of the household and was trying to make sure that we sustain ourselves, and her taking care of my father. So for a family like that, for a structure like that, and I can only talk about myself, but I can imagine if there is anything similar to that, or even worse, it's impossible for those parents. We have to be very fair to those parents and very understanding of the situation, and make sure that the education system actually helps those kids stand up for themselves. We have a lot of, like me, for example, I can tell you that we have a lot of sisters or brothers who end up being sort of the guardian or the representative of their younger siblings. Yeah. And what that means is they go there to parent-teacher interviews, for example, and they're having a conversation on behalf of their basically for their as sort of like a parent role, and we don't know how healthy that is for the siblings. We don't know how good it is in terms of the sibling who's an older student in that same school, and what that means for the younger kids. So there's a lot of those I think issues that are intertwined within racialized communities, and especially for Bangladeshi parents, like for example that mother or father who wrote in that Facebook group. I feel for them because they were in a dilemma because they didn't know whether they should question it, who they should question to, whether there was a support system, and how they will be taken as, because they don't want their child to be the problem child. I think that the happy thought on that is that recently the government took a big step in terms of suspension, and I think that will have a big impact in helping a lot of children.
Earlier I mentioned on the resources, that what kind of schools have what kind of resources, and how it actually sets up the kids of those neighborhood, those schools, for the future that is ahead. Now, the next question, is probably the most important question to our audience today. So currently, I'm in Bangladesh. I'll be head back to Canada next month. So even in the midst of COVID pandemic, we have seen something very interesting, that the federal government has actually increased the number of people that we actually taking on as immigrants, giving new immigrations. So, question to you. All those people who are actually working really hard in Bangladesh. I think, at least, I'm speaking about myself, that before going to Canada, I wish I should have been able to have some real conversation with people to understand that actually what to prepare for, and not to have a very naive or, a film represented version of understanding this is what Canada is. So my question has, it has two parts. First is that you, living in Canada, what are some of the major challenges you see? I'm not speaking about other communities, particularly Bangladeshi communities you think and you have seen they're struggling with, and Bangladeshis who are currently in Bangladesh, working through their immigration process to go and become, a part of Canadian society. What kind of, scenario they should keep in their head before actually moving to a country like Canada?
Well, I think you touched on something that we're as a Bangladeshi society in living in Canada, we're really struggling with, especially when So when I went to Bangladesh, and I a few years back, and I want to start with this story because I think it'll help viewers see where I'm coming from and what my understanding is. A few years back, I came to Bangladesh, and my research was focused on understanding retention, understanding why kids drop out of school, and really understanding the motivation of that. And what I found was, almost every other conversation, young kids, and I'm talking about high school students, all they wanted to do was leave the country and go abroad. And it was a very common answer that I got from a lot of grade 9, grade 10, or class 9, class 10 students in Bangladesh. And obviously trying to understand the mindset, trying to understand the motivation behind that. And it's that allure, sort of that that illusion of what abroad looks like, what Canada looks like, for example, what sort of life, like maybe the Canadian dream, if I should call it that, that is promised to a lot of these people, and it's not fully the fault of these, the people who are trying to come here, because there's a dream that's actually portrayed. There's sort of an illusion that's created, which doesn't actually help. And right now, what happens is we have governments where they are promising people, people who are skilled workers, people who are very educated, people who are practicing in their fields. And we're talking about doctors and engineers, and we're talking, different levels of skills in many different fields, that are professionals in Bangladesh, for example, who are coming here with the promise or with the idea that they will be able to practice in their field, and then they're just sort of forgotten, and they are unable to navigate through the system. And like you said for yourself, when you came here, you would have appreciated knowing sort of the roadmap. You would have appreciated knowing which doors to open and how, but that's not there. And the problem is it actually isn't there right now. That those doors don't even exist. Just during COVID, we had to push the government to understand the level of expertise and skills we have within different communities. For example, within the Bangladeshi community, the skills that we have, and how we could have actually benefited from that. It should, the government had actually taken the right steps to help those people recognize their credentials. And if we had more doctors, if we had nurses, then we would have been in a different place. Right now, as we're trying to open up schools, we're talking about having 500 schools, nurses will be dispersed in different schools. Well, where are these 900 nurses coming from? Well, we're already stretched very thin in our healthcare system, and a lot of nurses are already exhausted because they're overtiming, they're working, double the work that they should have been doing. And we're trying to open up the economy, we're trying to open up the whole province, and seeing that we need to make sure that we need all these professions, but we don't have access to them. Maybe we do, we just haven't figured out how to help those people transition through so that they can actually practice in their fields. And that problem remains in our province, I think across the country. And let's specifically talk about the Bangladeshi community. When we had the foreign credential recognition, there was a little bit of an opportunity that was created during COVID-19, and I was very excited. And then when after getting a lot of more information with the ministry, after pushing the ministry, we realized that it was a very short-lived opportunity where our government was essentially trying to take advantage of people who are highly skilled for a short time, without even promising them really any opportunity for later. And that's a huge problem, because what happens is you're only extracting the resources when you want it, but then sort of forgetting about it throughout. And that happens a lot with skilled workers, whether they're from Bangladesh, India, Pakistan, where many different countries as well, where we have very highly skilled people whose credentials are not recognized, and governments have promised, whether it was the Liberal government or the Conservative government that have promised this in the past, and they have failed to do this. And it hasn't been a priority. And I think that needs to be, when people are passing the border, this needs to be something that's also taken care of as they come into this place, so that we don't have, doctors who have practiced for years and years now doing X-rays and really, I don't even know I cannot even fathom what it does to their mental health, their family, what it does to a whole society where these people feel like they're not treated the way they should have been, and it really undermines the entire the strength of these people and the capabilities of these people. And we have a huge problem when we create that illusion, but we don't really live up to it. And governments need to play a big role in making sure that we create a transition system. And some of them exist. Some of the fields where they have that the process through colleges and universities actually have come up with plans. It just means we have to be proactive for others as well, and we have to make sure that we live up to the promise, so that people don't come here and end up doing something that they, especially when, imagine a doctor driving a taxi. Like, we have that right
now. How many hundreds?
We have that right now.
Yeah.
And the fact that we have that, and I'm just going to relate that back to what we're talking about, the children who end up being in the education system, who end up going on the street and facing reality every day. This really plays a role in how the children have opportunities. It plays a role in what kind of doors we're opening up for their family members and their kids and those kids as well. So.
Yeah, and I think it's a sticky issue too. I mean, I personally don't feel that I have the position to say somebody whether you should or should not go, given that our socioeconomic position right now in Bangladesh, and also the climate situation. I mean, right now, quarter of the Bangladesh is underwater, and if you think about the climate injustice that we haven't done the emissions, but Bangladesh emits 0.36% of the global greenhouse gas. But look at the consequences we're suffering. It is very. I mean, it has been the colonial tradition that you can do the brutal, unimaginable, despicable brutality in rest of the world, but you can maintain a very clean, sanitized version of image back home that we are the beacon of humanity and all of that, right? So in Bangladesh, it is possible for a Canadian garment factory to, that just produce clothes, or in a way the garment factory collapses, thousands of workers die. You can just try to explore natural resources, and the gas mine explodes. people suffer. But that's, white impunity, the Eurocentric impunity. And when you talked about experience, I think it's very different. If you'd have emigrated to Canada, let's say from a country like Ireland or Scotland or Australia or some European country, your experience is very different as opposed to when you emigrate from a country like Bangladesh. So they talk about Canadian experience, but that's a very loaded term. That again needs to be unpacked. Now, yeah, I'm sure that you have something to say about that.
I have so many thoughts. Firoz, you can't point out the government industry. You can't talk about environment. You can't talk about foreign credential recognition. There is just so much to it. There's just so much to it because just the past, I think 2 weeks ago, we passed a bill in Ontario to undermine the environmental assessment process in Canada. And
wow.
and the reason I want to point this out is because and it gave the minister power to decide which projects will go through environmental process or not.
Wow.
And we're dealing with the conservative government right now that has been brutal when it comes to the environment, when it comes to social justice, when it comes to some of the most essential services that we need in our province. So I do not have a lot of trust or faith in the minister or the government that they will make sure that all the projects that need to go through environmental assessment will go through this. And that is a huge problem. And the civil liberties rights organizations, a lot of different advocates have spoken out against it. Former premiers have spoken against it. And the reason I'm pointing this out is there's always a blame on the countries that are trying so hard, that are going through a huge economic crisis, that are really and people who are trying really hard to sustain themselves. The burden is always put on those nations, and Bangladesh being one of them, unfairly when the countries that benefit the most, like Canada, for example, that needs to do more. It like you said, there's sort of a beautified or a romanticized way of looking at it. And that happens a lot with a lot of developed, quote unquote, developed nations like the United States, like Canada. And it's really easy to put the burden on the countries that's already struggling economically, that's already got a huge international debt, for example, because it's easy to put those burden on them. And right now, that's what we're dealing with through the, in terms of environment. I want to be cautious that we're not doing so well in terms of our policies and the way things are. It is very problematic. We are not living up to the promises that we made in the agreements that the governments made, both federally and provincially. We have a long way to go, and I think we have to be very mindful of that. And that there's a responsibility on all of us, including yourself and myself, who are who have created sort of a stage or a space for people to learn about what's going on across Canada, around the world. So I just wanted to add that little piece, because I think it's important for a lot of people to find out what just recently took place in the province of Ontario.
Yeah, I mean, one of the questions that I always bring and the whole reason why this platform. I mean, right after moving to Canada, as a grad student, and I have experienced something is that looking at you have brought out an incredibly important point. People who are struggling just to put food on the table. Easy for me, walking on the corridors of academia for 20 years to have a critical perspective about something. That's what I have done all my life, but somebody who is waking up and, just to put food on the table, So one of the things that, the Social Justice Action Research Alliance is trying to do is bringing people from all over the world, be it America, be it Australia, be it, and yesterday I had a conversation with one of my former students, in order to puncture the myth that, the experience of going to America as a student, like I've been a guidance counselor, I've been an educator. So I work with the youth in Bangladesh very actively. When I work with this youth, I try to puncture the myth. Like, yes, things here are, in many ways difficult and challenging. And if you can, emigrate from here to a country like Canada, then please do. But have your skill ready. Do you have the proper technical training? Do you have the cultural understanding? Do you have an informed decision-making ability or the scope? So that's why these conversations are used to actually promote critical literacy. So our conversation is not ending here. We have a platform called World School of Bangladesh, where we bring in young students around the world, Bangladeshi or not Bangladeshi, together. Because, Fannie Lou Hamer said, nobody is free until everybody is free. The oppression that happens in Bangladesh is intimately connected to the oppression in Canada. So, they're not separated. Our separation is just an illusion, right? So I want to spend the last few minutes, before you go, and again, as I said, that I work with the youth. Let's say I want to come to Canada, and I will come to Canada. I'm determined, to immigrate there and settle down there. And I have done that, myself too. What would be your advice? Purely brutal, honest truth. That what are some of the things that I should take into consideration before making that decision? What should I expect? Not to have rose-tainted glass about understanding Canada. Not a discouragement, but the reality.
Well, I mean, so first I'll begin by saying that until we experience certain things for ourselves and learn from our mistakes, it's hard to really appreciate to any advice or any reality check, because the reality check really happens when you live through that. So I completely understand if someone listens to this and says, of course, it's easy for her to say. But I can only give you an example of what it was like for my parents, because I have seen them go through this experience, and it wasn't easy. It was very difficult. We came with nothing really. We probably a few dollars in our pockets, and just within a year, my father was unable to provide for the family and ended up in the hospital. So we have lived through a whole different experience than what it would be if, for example, you come through the education system. So if you're an international student, or if you're coming, because of the job market, and you have already obtained yourself a very stable position here that is guaranteed, and you can come and work here. So there are different scenarios for how you can end up living in Toronto or in any city in Canada. So I think I want to be, I just want to clear that out in terms of what that experience might look like. But a lot of people who end up coming here now, I think, are international students who are, I think they're going through a system where they're paying double the money than domestic students. So that means a huge cost burden for the parents living back home. And also after coming here, if going through the education system, and then obviously if they're able to obtain a job here, then they end up living here. So a lot of people who come here after, whether they're selling their land or whether they're pulling everything together or if they have debts, that means a lot of these kids who end up here have sort of a responsibility or a pull factor where they think that they have to repay that debt, which means that while they're studying, they're also ending up in a place to work, whether it's the subway or whether it's McDonald's or something like that. And those jobs can be very tough because you're trying to learn as well as you're trying to provide for yourselves or send something back home. That's a huge responsibility, and it's not easy, and that's the reality for a lot of people here. But it doesn't mean that sometimes as someone who has who was told that you have to work 3 times as hard to get somewhere, I still believe that I do have to do that, and I tell everyone else around me is that if the doors don't open, you just work 3 times as hard, because that's the only way that we can break those doors and open and make sure that we create that path for the rest of us who are coming tomorrow. So in that sense, what I'm trying to say is it's not totally not worth it. That if you could get through it, if you could live up to that, then yes, there's a point to you know, finding that path. There's a point to you coming in and you know, building a new life, especially for children, for a better education system. A lot of those things that plays a big role. So it really depends on where we are and what kind of abilities there are. There is a lot of, you know, families, for example, who migrate, who are, you know, Bangladeshis who have lived in other countries and then have come to Canada, and were able to you know, be entrepreneurs. Were able to provide their family in that was a little bit, maybe a little bit easier than it was for other families. It depends on where you are at, and it depends on how you're coming here. It depends on what kind of you know, what kind of, I guess, what do you have already promised to you, and make sure that those promises are correct, and there is some guarantee behind it, so that you know the whole truth and you know exactly what's going on. And there are some really good programs. There are some really good colleges and universities. There are some really good opportunities for a lot of people.
Yeah. I mean, you mentioned that, you know, the international students pay double. In some cases, 3 times or more. Like, for instance, the University of Toronto, the tuition fee for international students begin 61,000 and above. That's just, you're paying 61 grand a year. You know, forget about, you know, the cost of, you know, living and other expenses. So obviously, I think, you know, we cannot stop hoping, but of course, we shouldn't go somewhere with a myth that, you know, things will just automatically work out. Doly, you know, thank you very much for, you know, taking out some time from your extremely busy schedule. And what we're trying to build, you know, on this platform is to facilitate critical conversation, so that, you know, we start, you know, the building ability to read the world, what is happening. You know, James Baldwin said that when the victim is able to articulate the position why they are victimized, they're no longer, you know, just a victim. They become a threat for the oppressor, and that's the beginning point of the changes to come, right? So, you know, once again, thank you very much, you know, to come on, and we hope to have, you know, similar conversations in future, you know, on different issues. Have a wonderful day, and our audience, thank you very much for being with us.
Thank you, Firoz. This was wonderful having a conversation with you, and I look forward to the many other conversations you'll have on this platform.
Yeah, have a great day. Bye-bye.